We are streaming on the web at kmecradio.org. It is 1 o'clock Pacific Time, 4 o'clock Eastern Time. You are listening to Heroes and Patriots, which is a show about national security, intelligence, and foreign policy. It is hosted by myself, Mary Massey, and John Goodiron. Hey, John.
Good morning. Good afternoon. Mary, how are you?
I am pretty good. I wanted to...
Beautiful October day.
Right. I wanted to first thank everyone who has contributed to the fire victims' needs. Food banks are still open in Sonoma and Napa County. Here at the Mendocino Environmental Center, we have lots of things that we are looking for still, in particular toiletries, blankets. Nothing is too small. These folks are starting over. So thank you, everyone who has given. You also may still contribute to the Red Cross. If there's any concern about a charity that you are giving, we ask that you contact the BBB's give.org, which is a repository for nonprofit charities. So you can be sure you're giving to a real place. We are underwritten by Dr. Richard Phillips at the Ukiah Dental Center. Visit his website at ukiahdental.com. Dunlap Roofing with offices in Willits, Ukiah, and Fort Bragg. Visit their website at dunlaproofing.com. Fry Vineyards and Winery, America's first organic winery, located in Redwood Valley. They are America's first organic winery. Visit their website at frywine.com. And underwriting is also provided by Ore Hot Springs, a retreat and spa located between Mendocino and Ukiah. Reservations are required. Please call 462-6277 or visit their website to make your reservation at orehotsprings.org. Today is Monday, October 23rd, 2017. We are broadcasting live from the studios of the Mendocino Environmental Center, which is located in downtown Ukiah. Our shows are archived at kmecradio.org, and in an edited version, they are uploaded to both Facebook and YouTube. So please be sure to check out those social media. John, today our guest is Frederick Clarkson.
Yes, I'm a big fan of his. Why don't you read the bio, and then I'd like to ask the first question about the theocrats in the Trump administration. What is a theocrat? And in particular, I would like Mr. Clarkson to talk about Ray Moore, who in all likelihood will be the next U.S. Senator from Alabama. But go ahead with the intro.
Right. So, as mentioned, he's an American journalist and public speaker, primarily in the fields of politics and religion. He authored Eternal Hostility, The Struggle Between Theocracy and Democracy. And he edited Dispatches from the Religious Left, The Future of Faith and Politics in America. Presently, he has been a senior fellow for religious liberty at Political Research Associates in Somerville, Mass. since 2012. He was a columnist on religious liberty for the LGBTQ Nation in 2014 and 15. He is the author of a major report, When Exemption is the Rule, the Religious Freedom Strategy of the Christian Right, from Political Research Associates. And he is co-founder of Talk to Action, a group blog which features critical reports about religious right. He co-authored Challenging the Christian Rights, the Activist Handbook, and received the the Media Heroes of 1992, awarded by the Institute for Alternative Journalism. Mr. Clarkson, welcome to the program.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
So this is John. Thank you for being on the show, Frederick Clarkson. Let's get into it right away. What is a theocracy? Who are theocrats, and are they to be found in the Trump administration?
Well, they are, and most of our contemporary theocrats would probably say that they're not in favor of theocracy. But to be on the journey towards theocracy, requires a lot of different kinds of roads and different kinds of people. So let's talk briefly about Roy Moore before we get to the administration itself. Roy Moore, running for the Senate, is a perfect example of what we're talking about.
Right.
He's a man who has made a career of arguing that American law should be founded on the Ten Commandments, and he's tried to advance God's law as he understands it through his public offices wherever he could, including serving as Chief Justice, the elected Chief Justice of the Alabama Supreme Court twice, and he was twice removed for having violated federal court orders, which he thought were invalid. But that's who he is,
yeah.
And he embodies the kind of theocratic approach to politics and law that is typical of many contemporary Christian right activists, including some who populate the Trump administration now.
I mean, that's just, on the face of it, what you just said is remarkable. Here you have Roy Moore, who was twice elected on a statewide ballot as Chief Justice of the Alabama State Supreme Court, and twice removed from that office because he violated federal orders from a federal judge. This is extraordinary that this guy would have any kind of credibility in Alabama or any other state, but yet here he is.
Well, that's right, and it's important to give him credit where credit is due. He's an effective politician, and he's a populist of a certain style, and he's a kind of politician who likes to stick it to the man, and he isn't afraid of who he offends in pursuit of his ideas, and he's kind of an old school Southern populist. You know, he wears a cowboy hat and a black leather cowboy vest, and on his closing campaign rally, he pulled out a pistol and waved it around so he could demonstrate how in favor of gun rights he is. And then he went on to ride a horse to the polling place on election day. He's colorful and he's fun in a weird way, and not to be underestimated.
Now, I could half see how a theocrat would want to criminalize abortion or homosexuality if they were not going by the Constitution and only going by their very strict and rigid interpretation of the Ten Commandments. But I don't see where the Ten Commandments would play into resisting civil rights enforcement. What would be a theocrat's arguments against civil rights? I just don't get it.
Well, probably not against civil rights per se, but I think that Roy Moore would take a states' rights, kind of old school Southern states' rights approach about the role of the central government and the sovereignty of the states. And the theocrat view, at least coming out of the theocratic tradition of what's called Christian Reconstructionism, sounds a lot like what you might hear certain kinds of small government conservatives say, and that is that government should be handled at the lowest level possible. And so the idea that you hear from conservatives, including the theocratic kind of conservatives, is the creeping tyranny of the federal government that goes too far and is too secular and violates the rights of Christians. So Roy Moore, I don't think, is personally a racist, but he has that old school kind of states' rights sensibility that has the effects of racism when it comes to policy.
Your book, Eternal Hostility, the struggle between theocracy and democracy, is required reading, in my opinion, in understanding how Trump won and the forces that keep him in power. I'd like to have you talk a little bit about your 2016 report, which I think is also excellent, When Exemption is the Rule, the Religious Freedom Strategy of the Christian Right. Just speak about that report briefly, please.
Well, sure. The Christian right is a historic, religious and political movement, and their big social issues have been abortion and homosexuality, including marriage. But they lost in the Supreme Court twice now, and on related issues for a long time. So they know that battle is lost for the foreseeable future and is likely to continue to be the prevailing direction of the law of the land. So if you're them, what do? What they've tried to do is to carve out what we call exemptions based on rights of conscience. So we see it framed in terms of religious liberty. So if you're a bake shop owner, you might refuse to make a wedding cake for a same-sex couple because in your religious conscience you shouldn't have to in any way engage with or endorse or feel like you have to endorse something of which you disapprove. So the idea of an exemption strategy from individuals and businesses to colleges and universities and other kinds of institutions is the general strategy that the Christian right is pursuing to carve out zones that they can control that don't have to honor civil rights laws.
And are the courts upholding the exemption strategy?
Sometimes yes and sometimes no. It kind of depends. It's a broad. It's such a broad and tricky area to balance out, and balance isn't quite the right word, but to figure out how to respect both individual rights, including religious conscience, as well as protect the civil rights of all people. Civil rights, including ones that didn't used to exist, particularly for LGBTQ people. So, as a society, we're still struggling with it, but it's a mixed bag, and I'm not sure that the courts have quite figured out formulas for the right resolution.
You and I were speaking before we went on the air about a conference that was going on, I believe, in Washington, D.C. Could you tell our listeners a little bit about that?
Yes, it's called the Values Voters Summit, and it's been held for 12 years. It's hosted primarily by the Family Research Council, which is the largest Christian right lobby group in Washington, with state affiliates in 35 or 36 states. Mm-hmm. And it's the premier political conference of the Christian right these days. So there were several thousand people, and for the first time, the President of the United States spoke, and as well as Steve Bannon and Roy Moore. And I've been to a number of these things and been to a lot of conservative conferences over the years, and I have to tell you that this event was probably the most chilling, if you're concerned about their agenda, that I've seen in 25 years. There's coherence, they project political strength, they suggest a political plan, and a lot of it's rooted in religious liberty. Donald Trump has really delivered for them in certain areas there, and they're exuding a confidence that I haven't seen in a long time.
Do you consider Trump a conservative, an alt-right conservative, in your opinion?
I don't know what he is. I'm not sure he knows what he is.
Right.
But one thing that he did do is early in his campaign, he got the support of a faction of the Christian right, and when he became the nominee, they rallied around him. And it's interesting because even though he seems like such an unlikely person for them to support, given his personal morality and ethics and so on, and his dubious Christian credentials, he said he could deliver for them. And even though he had, from their point of view, a poor record on abortion, a poor record on marriage, he agreed with their agenda on religious liberty and exemptions and to pursue it should he become president. And that's what he's done. And he was treated like a conquering hero and basked in the glory when he was there. And
then, his vice president, Mike Pence, who does seem to wear that cloak, if you will, to be an alt-right conservative. In a way, they do have that leadership in him, do they not?
Well, they definitely do. Pence is an important voice in the administration. And as John was asking about earlier, he has been a key figure in helping to populate the administration with other Christian right figures, whether it's Betsy DeVos or Ben Carson or even the director of the CIA, Pompeo. The Christian right is better represented and in an administration, in powerful positions and policy-making positions than any time in the history of the country.
Back in May, didn't the president sign something called the Religious Liberty Executive Order? What was that all about? And I understand from friends who work on the Hill that the House Subcommittee on Government Operations also had a hearing on the Johnson Amendment that played into that. Would you like to talk about that for a moment?
Sure. The Religious Liberty Executive Order was kind of a fizzle. It basically didn't say anything more than was already in existing law. And so I think all sides were surprised at what a nothing burger it actually was. Now, they did talk about the Johnson Amendment, which is important to think about a bit, because what that was an amendment that was sponsored by Lyndon Johnson in the 50s that really is the basis of our tax-exempt code, right, which is the 501c3 tax code, which allows non-profits to have a federal tax exemption as long as they stay out of electoral politics, neither advocating for or opposing candidates in any way.
And
now,
I'm sorry, go on.
Go ahead.
Well, I was going to mention even such bogus quote-unquote churches like Scientology have got that exemption, so it's immensely valuable.
It is immensely valuable, and it's there are lots of what shall we say, gray areas in the law in terms of enforcement, and it's tricky because on the one hand it's a fair and reasonable standard for the privilege of tax exemption. It's not a right. And on the other hand, it's tricky because in the actual areas of the First Amendment and religious liberty, we have to tread carefully in how much the government gets to decide what is in fact a valid religion and what is not. I think that that administrations over past decades have erred on the side of more than caution and been more than generous in extending, turning a blind eye to egregious violations of the standard. So that's been part of the Christian right's political strategy for a long time, that is to abuse their federal tax status to advance political interests.
So we had this hearing on May 4th. The Subcommittee on Government Operations convened the hearing. It was in the Rayborn building. It was to examine the Johnson Amendment's effect on churches and other not-for-profit organizations' right to freedom of speech. A very short witness list. You had Tony Perkins of the Family Research Council, you had Christina Holcomb of the Alliance for Defending Freedom, and you had Rabbi David Saperstein of the Religious Action Center. What was the summary of some of that testimony?
Well, I have to say I didn't see the hearing, so I can't tell you exactly what the testimony was. But I can guess what or maybe you did, and maybe you can tell us. But their basic argument has always been that the churches should be free to speak from the pulpit about politics and their concerns, and that it's an unfair intrusion of the federal government to limit their speech in that way. It's a suppression of Christianity and of religious viewpoints in public life.
Right.
I think that's preposterous on its face, and in fact, there have been very few enforcement actions by the IRS ever against churches. Yep. Usually they send, when people are shown to have violated the rules, they're usually sent a warning letter, and there's a pro forma investigation, and then the churches are warned, don't do it again. There's only been one church in the history of the United States that ever lost its tax-exempt status for violating the Johnson Amendment rules.
And which church was that?
It was a church at Pierce Creek in Binghamton, or near Binghamton, New York, that anti-abortion activist Randall Terry was a member of. And they took out full-page ads in USA Today and other papers against President Clinton.
Yeah, it would seem to be that there's a lot of unresolved issues that eventually the Supreme Court will have to decide on here. Again, we're speaking about the Johnson Amendment, which prohibits churches and charitable organizations from engaging in any political campaign activity, and violators risk losing their tax-exempt status or facing penalty excise taxes. But the problem is the amendment is an absolute prohibition. It's what the law calls an absolute prohibition that results in self-censorship and chills church leaders' political speech even when the current issues intersect with that church's core beliefs. So therein lies the unresolved legal issue. Do you see any of these cases percolating up to the Supreme Court anytime soon?
I don't think there are any cases.
Okay.
Wow.
This is the thing. There's been no enforcement action.
Okay.
So how could there be a case?
Right.
It's what's going on now is that they would like the Congress to take action to modify the Johnson Amendment to give them more latitude. And while that's possible, that could happen, boy, it's a Pandora's box of problems that would be open.
Right.
Because then, if it can be done here, it changes the tax code not just for churches, although they could target it that way. But all right, if they target churches, we're talking actually about religious institutions, not just Christian churches, right?
Mm-hmm,
but
right.
synagogues and mosques. And and any other kind of religious institution. And they're seeking a great deal of less transparency and less capacity for the government to look into their internal finances and be accountable to make sure that they deserve and have earned their tax exemption. So when this opens up the problems potentially of illegal contributions,
right.
Politically motivated contributions, and even foreign contributions, which raises all kinds of problems. So I think that the Congress will probably drag its feet on this because it's a real Pandora's box of problems.
Can a pastor or a rabbi run for office, and are there any prohibitions on any restrictions on their speech, political speech at that point?
Oh, there's no restrictions on their political speech whatsoever.
Okay.
A pastor or rabbi can walk outside the church, stand on the sidewalk, and say, I endorse, Donald Trump for president, and that's all perfectly legal. They can spend their own money, and they can do whatever they want to do, as long as they're not representing their institution
okay.
or in any way using tax-exempt funds and tax-exempt resources.
Right.
So if a pastor makes an endorsement or from the pulpit, he's using tax-exempt resources of his salary and the tax-exempt resources that keep the building going and heat it and air condition, all that kind of stuff. So that's really the issue. It's about the money.
It's 22 minutes past the hour, and if you've just joined us, you're listening to Heroes and Patriots with host John Goodiron and myself, Mary Massey. Our guest today is Frederick Clarkson. He is an American journalist and public speaker in the fields of politics and religions. You are an author and a journalist, and I noticed that in Indiana there is, by Representative Jim Lucas, he has drafted a bill that would require professional journalists to be licensed by state police. His thinking is that his signature issue is gun rights, and therefore it follows that journalists should also be licensed. Could you speak to that briefly, and how you feel about that as a journalist?
Well, it's an outrageous, violation of the First Amendment. I mean, if the Christian right should be up in arms about that. If you can license journalists, you can certainly license any other form of First Amendment expression. Mm-hmm. I think it's a non-starter, but it certainly speaks to the attitudes and the contempt for the First Amendment and
right.
journalists in particular that some hold.
Right. Also, go ahead, John.
I had a question. I wasn't finished with the.
I'm sorry.
With the Johnson Amendment there. I have an email that was just forwarded to me from one of our listeners, and they quoted Dr. Martin Luther King. Again, we're talking about what the restrictions on political speech are on members of the clergy and their churches. And Dr. Martin Luther King and others spoke forcefully from the pulpit on political matters. And in fact, Dr. King once wrote, according to our listener, and I quote, "The church must be reminded that it is not the master nor the servant of the state." I repeat, the church must be reminded that it is neither the master nor the servant of the state, but rather the conscience of the state. It must be the guide and the critic of the state, and never its tool. End of quote. That really runs pretty counter to the Johnson Amendment, don't you think?
Not even close.
Not even
a close call.
Okay.
Pastors and clergy of all sorts are allowed to, the way the Johnson Amendment reads and the way the actual IRS rules are written, right, that you can speak forcefully on anything you want. You can even speak to specific issues of public policy, legislation, and ballot initiatives up to a point. What you can't do is endorse or in any way support candidates.
Okay.
And there's a difference between electoral politics and having a perspective on public affairs.
I see.
Everybody has a right to bring their religiously informed viewpoint into the public square, almost without exception. If you want the privilege of a federal tax exemption, you have certain restrictions on what you can and can't do. If you don't, want the privilege of a federal tax exemption, you can say and do anything you want.
Okay.
Very good.
Mary, I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Okay, so you've written articles on many First Amendment rights, as mentioned already, and I'm looking at one that you wrote this past August on the Charlottesville events. It's called the right wing. This hate group that rioted in Charlottesville believes they are Christian crusaders for the South, violent would-be revolutionaries who intend to make their vision a reality. Talk about that article and what has been the outcome of that.
Well, one of the groups that marched in the Torchlight Parade that people remember very vividly, I'm sure, is a group called the League of the South. And it's been around for a few decades that with a vision of reviving the Confederacy. And they speak of Southern nationalism. Mm-hmm. And it's been based in white nationalism, white supremacy, lots of winking references to the Ku Klux Klan and that sort of thing over the years. And they're not just racially motivated neo-Confederates, but they also have a distinct Christian vision and the idea of the defense of Christendom in a real historic sense, referring back to the Battle of Tours with Charlemagne in the 8th century, fending off Muslim invasion of Europe. And he speaks about the need to defend modern Christianity in the same sense. It's not just the war of civilizations we see going on with Trump foreign policy, but the idea of ordinary Christians of a certain sort defending creeping secularism in all of its manifestations and foreign and false religions. So to form an army of Christian warriors to take that vision forward is part of what they're about.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Very good. I can't help but bring up we've been talking about the First Amendment, and this event seemed to talk about the Second Amendment as such as well, because of the bearing of assault rifles and so forth. We've seen the assault rifles used in Las Vegas and other areas. The Second Amendment, can you speak to that? Because I know you have had, you've supported the campaign to defend the Constitution, which I believe is no longer active. Could you speak to that in what the Second Amendment and how it applies to peaceably assembling and freedom of religion and so forth?
Well, a complicated matter, to be sure.
Well, yeah.
The Second Amendment in its day was intended to, one thing, guns were not as common in those days, but
right.
Many people had them for purposes of hunting and self-defense. But given the experience of the Revolution, the thought was that you might need guns to fend off an intrusive federal government or a foreign invasion. So that was the idea of a certain amount of gun ownership and the ability to, say, form a militia. But in contemporary society, things have changed. Couldn't have possibly envisioned that way. But gun ownership wasn't intended for purposes of a public display and independently marching around and threatening people with guns. But that's kind of what the open carry laws that's been happening in the past decade or so. That allows people not just to have an old West-style gun in the holster, but to carry around automatic weapons in threatening ways. Mm-hmm. So paramilitary groups have been doing that, including, as we saw in Charlottesville, all over the country. And they're the kinds of people with a similar kind of League of the South sensibility, or the Christian rights sensibility, that they might need to be standing up against the creeping tyranny of the federal government and defend themselves and maybe need to even organize themselves militarily. I think we see a lot of examples of that around the country.
Right. We're talking about groups, obviously, that are not the National Guard or the Army Reserve, but,
Self-appointed vigilantes.
Right. You there?
Yeah.
Okay. Just have a little change in the tone there.
So
yeah, I had to switch phones. The battery was dying on one.
Oh, okay.
so here in Mendocino County, Mr. Clarkson, we have a very strong libertarian movement, and in fact, at one point had a sheriff, Tony Craver, and a district attorney, Norm Vroman, who were both members of the Libertarian Party, and were, in fact, I think at the time, the highest members of elected office here in California, who were members of the Libertarian Party. Needless to say, they were tax resistors. They were a very strong Amendment 2 proponents and right to carry proponents. But I also got the sense from them that they were very interested in maintaining a strong militia that would perhaps have resisted any president declaring martial law and sending the National Guard into Mendocino County. That this militia would in fact resist the National Guard and martial law. Are you seeing any evidence of that in other parts of the country where the religious right is playing into the militia movement and in fact are organizing private armies, as it were?
Well, the short answer is yes. Going back into the 1990s when the militia movement really first became a big thing, the biggest and most prominent militia at the time was the Michigan militia. And it was founded by a Baptist minister who also owned a gun store, and one of the elders of his church, who became the chaplain of that militia. And they explained, in video of their training sessions, their orientation-ships to new members, that what this was about was abortion. And it was like the idea that somehow the federal government was going to come in with political and military force to allow abortion to continue, even if local authorities decide to shut them down. And the Constitution Party, used to be called the U.S. Taxpayers Party, has taken a similar view. And they really believe in much the way that Roy Moore believes in state sovereignty and the idea that abortion under God's law should be made illegal, and it's up to what they call lower civil magistrates to enforce God's law and to organize militias to stand up to the federal tyranny. That idea is common across the Christian right and much of the libertarian movement and certainly the militia movement.
Thank you.
Very good. I wanted to fast forward a little bit to September, and in Nashville, Tennessee, there was an anti-LGBTQ Nashville statement. It was developed by the Council for Biblical Manhood and Womanhood and the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, ERLC. You've written about this. I wondered if you could kind of encapsulate what that whole thing was about and what it means for LGBTQ people.
Well, it doesn't have any immediate meaning for anybody, really. But what its significance is that conservative, reformed-oriented religious leaders of a Presbyterian stripe and within the Southern Baptist Convention. That's what the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission is. It's the public policy arm of the Southern Baptist Convention, the largest Protestant denomination in the country. And it wasn't a denominational statement so much as a group of leaders and theologians getting together and saying, this is what we think about sexuality and marriage in a coherent theological fashion, and what they stand for and what they're opposed to. So it's an old-fashioned idea that people can understand very well, and that is that all sex outside of heterosexual marriage is a sin against God's laws. Premarital sex among kids, no. Adultery? No. LGBTQ sexual orientation, sex? No. None of those things. And so they wanted to say it clearly and with a biblical justification to each other and to their various religious and political constituencies, saying this is where we stand, and as well within the tradition of how Christian factions organize themselves. They figure out where they stand, and they provide a biblical justification, saying here's where we're going, folks.
I had a question on some of the roots of the religious right, as it were, and this is going to seem a little wacky because I guess most wouldn't associate the Reverend Moon, the Sun Myung Moon, to be the religious right, but it's the thinking of some that the religious right could trace its roots to the Reverend Moon. Moon hated America. He hated our tradition of individual rights and independent thought. He hated the democracy, and he wanted to place it with theocracy under his rule. How does Reverend Moon play into the religious right, the emergence of political empires, say of Jerry Falwell, etc., and going forward right up to Pence and Santori and the modern religious right?
Cruz.
Well, yeah, it's kind of a hidden part of American history. The Christian right was in its early formations, and conservative political interests wanted to encourage that, including overseas. So the Korean Central Intelligence Agency, under the dictatorship at the time, helped to formulate the Unification Church of Sun Myung Moon. And Moon missionaries were over here, and eventually Moon himself was over here,
right.
Supporting the most extreme versions of American foreign policy,
right.
and helping to create what we now see as the Christian right, encouraging and funding conservative Christian political elements where they could, and they played an enormous behind-the-scenes role. The big direct mail fundraiser. Richard Viguerie was essentially subsidized by Unification Church interests.
Correct.
Throughout his entire career.
His direct mail operations.
Nearly as effective, a genius fundraiser as met the eye.
Right.
And Jerry Falwell was found in organizations deep in debt at some point, and a Moon Front group bailed him out to the tune of several $1 million. So, yeah, they've been in there to finance, organize, and prop up major Christian right figures and institutions for 50 years.
What happened to the Moon Organization? We associate that as an artifact of the 1980s, but in fact, are they that dormant?
Not at all. Since Reverend Moon died, his sons have been fighting over control of the empire, as it were. But the Unification Church exists in a variety of forms, and they're very present in this country, and they're very wealthy and politically influential. For example, they have a gun manufacturing outlet that's headquartered in Pennsylvania.
That's crazy.
The name of which escapes me at the moment, but I remember that during the campaign, Donald Trump Jr. made a personal appearance at their gun manufacturing operation, and there were pictures, and he was in the local media. So the Moon Organization, in its various expressions, is very active in American political life at the highest levels.
Yeah, an excellent article in this regard is Robert Parry's of Consortium News, How Reverend Moon's Snakes Infested the U.S.
Yes.
And they're still here. I mean, that's just crazy that the Unification Church would own a gun manufacturing company in Pennsylvania. Talk about the separation of church and state.
Right. I was wanting to talk a little bit about the emergence of the religious left. The New York Times had an article in June of this year that talks, I think, a lot about what you are about. And when did the religious left begin? Who is leading that? Who is continuing to carry the torch? Could you speak about the emergence of the religious left?
Well, there's certainly always been, religious progressives, for a long time. In fact, one of my first jobs in Washington when I moved there after college was working for Clergy and Laity Concerned, which was the ecumenical outgrowth of clergy and laymen concerned about Vietnam, which was founded by Martin Luther King and William Sloane Coffin and others as the religious front against the Vietnam War. So these kinds of elements have been there, forever. I would differ from the Times article in saying that there's anything analogous to the religious right on the left. Religious right is a very organized and coherent political and religious force. The religious left, such as it is disparate and not well organized. And the Times article featured three people: Reverend William Barber of North Carolina, of whom I'm a great fan, but he says, "Oh no, he's not liberal or left. He's about biblical justice." And Jim Wallace of Sojourners had, denounced the religious left and said he wasn't a part of it a decade ago, and there are lots of articles about that. So it's kind of funny that it's true that there are religious liberals and progressives who do and say good things, but to say that there's a coherent religious left is just false.
Huh. Okay. So, wow.
We have emails that are pouring into us right now, Mr. Clarkson, about Reverend Moon. Thought you might be interested in some of this. I knew it. I had opened up a Pandora's box when I mentioned his name.
It's a big subject.
It's a big subject, and it's a forgotten chapter in American history, as you correctly point out. The religious right has its roots, has its origins with the Reverend Moon going back to the Carter administration.
Farther back than that.
Yeah, and this listener points out that that the Reunification Church had ties to major crime syndicates, including the Japanese Yakuza, Latin American cocaine cartels. Federal prosecutors had looked into this. Congressional committees were looking into this, and like federal prosecutors, chose to look the other way. Moon was allowed to continue pouring hundreds of millions of dollars a year into his newspaper and other pro-Republican media outlets, again, without any consequences with regard to the separation of church and state. You had numerous former church insiders speaking to a lot of these criminal activities, these links to organized crime, these links to drug cartels, these links to money laundering operations. So they were substantiated by insiders. And again, the Department of Justice, U.S. Customs, and Congress all chose to give the Unification Church a free pass, it would seem, because they were a cash operation and some of that cash was going their way. So this is some of the feedback we're getting from listeners.
Well, all that's true. Like I said, it is a big subject. And part of the origins, as I mentioned, of the Unification Church is they were at least in part a creature of the Korean CIA. And
right.
The main political operator, Moon's number two, was this guy Bo Hee Pak, who was the Korean intelligence liaison to the American intelligence community going back to the Kennedy administration. So there was a lot of knowledge. We can't quite prove complicity between the American intelligence community and the Korean intelligence community in terms of the operations they were running.
Right.
There was an event called Koreagate, the congressional investigation that the emailer mentioned. Congressional investigation, which there are big, long congressional reports, and that was about Korean intelligence infiltration of the Congress and the White House, and manipulation of American religious and political communities in both parties. So yes, it was a very big deal, and the Unification Church, Sun Myung Moon, was a big part of it. And there's no question about it. I think that they have enjoyed, what shall we say, a protected status, because to really look into them opens up too many questions of the sort that the emailer has raised.
Wasn't there some kind of connection between the Unification Church and Auguste Record of the French drug cartel, the French, otherwise known as the French Connection, during the.
That I don't know.
Okay. Yeah.
There were certainly ties to Bolivian drug traffickers and generals in the 80s who led what was called the cocaine coup.
Right.
I think General Meza, who was part of that, is now in prison in the United States.
Yeah, this is.
So, yeah, there have been a lot of those kinds of high-level organized crime connections.
So
I don't know about the French connection.
Our core audience here are national security professionals, intelligence professionals, and federal law enforcement professionals. And I'm getting emails right now from some of them, some of whom I know personally and have working relationships with, who are now telling me that Moon first sank his roots down in Uruguay during the 12-year reign of the right-wing military dictators down there who seized power in 1973. His first entree to our hemisphere was not directly on U.S. soil, but was to the right-wing military dictators of Uruguay.
That may be true, but that's not the first entry in the United States. Like I said, it goes back to at least the early years of the Kennedy administration, to my knowledge.
Wow.
And that's well documented in the Fraser report, and also in the book by the guy who was the staff director of the Fraser Committee investigation, a guy named Robert Betcher, and his book is called Gifts of Deceit.
Wow. And
that Moon had relationships with military dictators in some of the other military juntas, Argentina, Paraguay, Chile.
Yes, absolutely.
Ingratiating himself with these juntas, helping the military regimes arrange arms purchases.
They had one of the newspapers owned by the same company, the Moon Company that owned the Washington Times, had a New York daily newspaper called Noticias del Mundo.
Right.
And it served as a propaganda vehicle for the dictatorships of the Southern Cone in that era.
Yeah. So, again, just, truth stranger than fiction, that the reunification church would have been so ingratiated with military juntas in some of the banana republics of South America, would have been embedded itself into the cocaine cartels as well. And again, not as a church as we know it, but as a instrument of the Korean intelligence apparatus and the U.S. intelligence apparatus as well. This is the stuff that if you were to make a movie about it, people would say it's implausible, nobody will believe it.
Stranger than life, yeah.
Here's a very credible guest, Frederick Clarkson, here to tell us that this is true, and then some.
Well, indeed. And one other element of it worth considering here is not as people remember the Iran-Contra scandal, and the after Congress stopped funding of the Contras, they found ways around it through third-party means. And one of those means was something called the World Anti-Communist League, which was an international collection of conservative and openly fascist and leftover from World War II Nazi elements that the Unification Church, through its Japanese affiliate, was a direct member. And the leaders of the Japanese affiliate were also leaders of the Japanese Yakuza. So there are lots of important sort of criminal and fascist international connections in this thing as it relates to American foreign policy.
Yeah.
I'd like to circle back a little bit to the Political Research Associates. And you have some terrific writers and fellows and contributors on your website. It's located at politicalresearch.org. Could you speak to some of the advancing social justice, in particular for women and the LGBTQ racial bias and so forth? Could you speak to how your organization is involved with that?
Well, from the earliest days, the founder Gene Hardesty understood the need for understanding the formidable opponents of LGBTQ rights, and that's really the origin of PRA. But there was always in the context of a larger struggle for social justice, including and especially racial justice, and that's been part of our our history, through all of these years.
Mm-hmm.
So, others of our fellows and the executive director are integrally involved in areas of reproductive justice and advancing LGBTQ rights. We try to frame all of these things in a larger context of what's happening with the right and what the right's agenda is, while at the same time trying to inform these ongoing struggles for social justice.
Right.
So we have a unique role in that regard, I think. Not that other people don't do a lot of good work, but trying to provide an integrated and comprehensive understanding in a way that's accessible to people, to scholars, activists, and journalists, is what we think of our distinctive contribution.
Correct. And you also, looking at the issues that the organization covers, you have immigrant justice, economic justice, as well as the fascism, which you mentioned, and the alt-right, and exporting the cultural wars in Africa. These are all important issues that your organization is writing about, speaking about, and so forth. We have about, 8 or 9 minutes left, and I wondered if there was any topic that you would like to inform our listeners or educate our listeners about, and ways that maybe perhaps folks can get involved in your organization and some of your issues, either on the state level or in their local communities.
Well, absolutely. People should check out the website, which you mentioned, politicalresearch.org. It's chock full of useful resources for understanding the history as well as the current state of things. And I guess I would encourage people, this is something that isn't talked about that much, but I referred to earlier, and that is a lot of our activism, a lot of our journalism is very siloized, around issue areas. It develops a particular body of knowledge. It's very in the moment in terms of threats and opportunities, and it's very singular in its approach, even when there are allies and coalitions involved. But to try to develop a broader understanding of the forces that are arrayed against us, mm-hmm. and broader understanding for journalists and scholars of the context in which these things happen. It's easy when you're a hammer to find the nail, but to look at how the architecture of the whole building really is the task.
Mm-hmm. I see. So we talked about the politicalresearch.org website. You're available for visits and public speaking and so forth. Is there a speakers bureau where folks might be able to tap into you or your other colleagues for speaking about these issues?
Well, I think people can write directly to the organization. There are emails on the website, and that would be the way to do it. Various of us do a fair amount of media and public speaking and are always open to invitations. And
are you preparing any conferences or the like in the upcoming months, or anything in particular in 2018 that you would like to let our listeners know so that they might be informed or keep an eye on things?
Oh my, we don't really organize conferences. We do participate in them, but you never know. And I'm sorry I can't think of anything right off the top of my head.
Oh, that's okay.
If people want to organize one, we'd love to talk about it.
So we've been talking about the Christian right and how the Christian left seems to be maybe disorganized. Is there a way that you see your role as helping to help organize folks on the left, as opposed that there seems like such a momentum going for the alt-right? What's the best thing that can take place?
Well, I think at least on the religious side of things that there are organizations that with whom we collaborate, who, for example, the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice has this sort of intersectional understanding of the way that reproductive rights factors into a larger picture of things, and engages in their own understanding the role of the religious right and anti-abortion opponents very seriously. So they're a good example of one that does this sort of thing, and one that we want to help. I think that one of the failures, but needs to be seen as an opportunity now, and that is that things have changed. Our religious institutions and our various organizations that deal with politics and social issues were invented in another time. And we face a very different kind of situation now than we ever had before. People who follow technology know that the law, has not kept up with the tremendous advances in technology. Similar kinds of things happen with our social and political life as well. A couple of prominent historians have said in recent interviews that we don't even have the vocabulary and the categories with which to talk about and understand what's going on in our culture and politics right now. So part of the task is just to catch up with those things in our knowledge and our framing and our concepts, so that we can talk to each other and come up with coherent strategies and approaches to writing and thinking about these things.
Do you think voters
it's extraordinary the pace at which things are happening.
Yeah, I Mr. Clarkson, I grew up in the Catholic Church, actually studied to be a Maryknoll missionary for a year, and I can remember when Catholics had a real activist movement, very concerned with peace and social justice, starting with the Maryknollers. When you read about Catholic Church...
It's the Maryknollers, absolutely.
Exactly, being killed in places like El Salvador and Guatemala. It was Maryknollers who were fighting for peace and social justice, often just outright insubordinate to orders from the Vaticans to stop. You had the Berrigan brothers. I lived at the Jonah House for a year in Baltimore. I graduated from Johns Hopkins, and for part of the time I was a student there, I lived at the Jonah House with the Berrigan brothers. That was a big deal. You had the Catholic workers movement. Our friend Ray McGovern from the CIA, who was a frequent guest on our show, is very active with the Catholic workers movement. What happened to the church? Where did the activism go? Where did Christ's preoccupation with peace and social justice go in the modern church? Why did it all vanish?
Well, it's a very good question. I don't think there's any one simple answer. Speaking for, I think, the broader progressive tradition in Christianity and Catholicism in the mainline churches, I think the successes of the latter part of the 20th century and advancing women's rights, gay and lesbian civil rights, stopping the Vietnam War, being the principal opposition voice to the excesses of American foreign and corporate policy, and being effective at it, meant that certain interests had to turn their attention to these institutions and neutralize those voices in a variety of ways. I've written about the way it was done with the Protestant mainline churches. I haven't studied the way it manifested in the Catholic Church, but I would guess that similar things happened.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, we have been talking with Frederick Clarkson, and we are so thankful that you were able to join us today. We hope you will come back as things develop in your area of politics and religion. And thank you again for being our guest, and we look forward to having you back at some point.
Well, thank you for the good conversation, and I'll be glad to anytime.
And we keep you and your work in our prayers.
Thank you.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.
So our guest has been Frederick Clarkson. He is an American journalist and public speaker in the fields of politics and religion. He authored Eternal Hostility, The Struggle Between Theocracy and Democracy, and he edited Dispatches from the Religious Left, The Future of Faith and Politics in America. He has been a senior fellow for religious liberty at Political Research Associates in Somerville, Mass. since 2012. He was a columnist on religious liberty with LGBTQ Nation in 2014 and 15. He's the author of a major report, When Exemption is the Rule, the Religious Freedom Strategy of the Christian Right, from Political Research Associates. He is the co-founder of Talk to Action, a group blog which is now no longer active, but has some critical reports on file about the religious right, I should say. So that is our show for today. Again, we'd like to thank our underwriters, Dr. Richard Phillips at the Ukiah Dental Center located at 307 Luce Avenue. Visit his website at ukiahdental.com. Dunlap Roofing, roofing and gutter services with offices in Fort Bragg, Ukiah, and Willits. Visit their website at dunlaproofing.com. Fry Vineyards and Winery, located in Redwood Valley, their website, frywine.com. And finally, Or Hot Springs, Retreat and Natural Hot Springs in